So for today, we have Mary Jane Bradbury with us. So she has 35 years experience as a speaker, educator, and actor. She's a speaker for Humanities Montana and Colorado Humanities, and she's an artist in residence for the C.M. Russell Museum in Great Falls and the Montana Historical Society. She visits schools and venues throughout the Rocky Mountain West, offering a variety of historic character portrayals, as well as workshops and residencies designed to teach participants of all ages the techniques and value of history through storytelling. Before moving to Montana in 2014, she was an interpretive enactor for the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where she designed costumes for exhibits on Ben Franklin, the Titanic, and Pompeii. She pioneered the museum's enactment program, interpreting historic aspects of natural history and modern science for permanent exhibits and educational programs. Also a commercial and industrial film actor and spokesperson, she spent time on the other side of the camera, writing and producing educational videos for museums and corporations. She's costume and prop manager for the Montana PBS series The Story of Us, and she holds a master's degree in speech communication from Regis University. She also has made a lot of the dresses that you find in the original governor's mansion, one of which is next to us here today, and has done a lot of interpreting for the Montana Historical Society. So we are very lucky to have her here today to talk about petticoats, pants, and politics, fashion, and the quest for freedom. So welcome, Mary Jane.
Welcome, and thank you for being here this evening. I see some familiar faces that I have seen from being in front of a room in the past. I'm normally not myself in front of a room. I'm usually somebody else. So this is kind of a not very normal thing for me, although I loved this request by Laura to talk about, we first thought about clothing from the 19th century, which is the time when Montana was growing and people were coming here. But as I got into this and realized just how closely clothing reform and political and social reform were tied together, I thought, well, let's take a dive into that and look at how much clothing represented in the changes that were coming into our politics, into our society, over the 19th century. And to get to the 19th century, though, I have to skip quickly over some groundwork that I want to lay about how things are the way they are when we get to the beginning of the 19th century. Clothing has always been a way for people to be regulated within a society. The leaders of a society can assign clothing to people by class, by gender, and once those clothing assignments are made, that becomes the status quo. You're supposed to wear what you're supposed to wear. But clothing has also been a way to rebel. People have used clothing over the centuries to rebel against that oppression, and that's what the 19th century really represents. So these changes in clothing, norms, have been nothing short of revolutions in many cases. We'll hear from both sides of the story about the idea of freedom of dress as essential as any other freedom. And as I said, I'll start looking at the overview. I want to say a few things about the story. When we're telling the story from history in our culture, it's largely the story of white, middle and upper class people. And the assumption that anybody who wasn't that wanted to be that. Those are the people who made the rules. Those are the people who made the laws. So whether or not you could participate in making those rules or laws, you at least wanted to be on the right side of those people and conform. So right there starts us thinking this isn't going to work out real well for everybody. And we can't talk about this topic or anything in history without getting into language and concepts and things that are not comfortable today. So we might be using some language and concepts that go right up to the edge of propriety, but I promise that we will regain our dignity in short order, and we will be seeing how all of that unfolds into the story. So, starting from the beginning, We're all born naked. And then we have to put clothing on. Our species doesn't come very equipped to be without it in the natural world. Nature doesn't have a concept of male or female clothing. Clothing is just clothing until we assign meaning to it. And as people began living in groups, and there were hierarchies formed, it was a good thing. The powers that be used clothing to assign identities to people within the group. It made a nice way to have a status quo. The meaning of clothing defined your place in society. If those identities hadn't been so important throughout history, it would just all be clothing, and we could all just wear whatever we wanted. But that's not what happened. So medieval Europe sets the stage for the diverging meaning of clothing, with trousers and pants being assigned to men. Pants became a symbol of male power. And if a woman of any age wore pants, she was not just trying to be comfortable and practical about going about her day. She was an affront to male authority. And it was quickly put aside. The meaning of pants emerged as a clear reflection of that male authority. Now, eventually, outerwear for everyone is going to need underwear, because outerwear was leathers and silks and woolens, and those weren't very easy to clean historically. So a nice layer of clothing underneath all of the outerwear was very practical. Make it out of a utilitarian fabric. You can clean it much easier. So undergarments came into existence. The whole idea of undergarments soon moved away from just protecting the outer clothing from the body, the oils and sweat and such. Men's clothing was practical and functional and mostly comfortable in style, and their undergarments were a version of what was on the outside. But women's clothing, with the development of underwear, began to force women's bodies into uncomfortable and often immobilizing shapes to satisfy society's ideal of a female role and beauty. And the ideals about what was beautiful, turn it on, changed over the years. From voluptuous to column, to a large stomach, to large hips, to a big backside, everything coming in and out over the centuries, all engineered by these wonderful underpinnings. Women wrote of the pain of wearing some of these contraptions, but they also wrote about the satisfaction of achieving the right look, because their character was judged on how acceptable they were to society. And you were acceptable if you showed up the way people wanted you to show up. And so this is what women went through. We'll go a little more deeply into women's clothing in a minute, but we'll start with men's clothing because it has a very short story. Men's clothing was not tied to political and social reform like women's was. But one major turning point for men's clothing was the development of the three-piece suit. In the early 1700s, the typical clothing for anyone of a high status, let me get back online here, was a lot of maybe brocades and opulent fou-for-all. This clothing signified status and aristocratic rank and a high place in society. American colonies had their own version of aristocrats and common folk, but it wasn't quite as elaborate as some of the clothing that was coming from Europe. But as those monarchies began to lose their absolute influence, the clothing got more subtle and toned down. This was the beginning of that three-piece suit, and it went along with a new idea of liberal individualism for men. Think about the philosophers of the time, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Montesquieu. They were all talking about individual liberties and human rights. And so by the early 1800s, people were beginning to make the connection between the sparer, toned-down suit and ideals of human rights. Everybody from the most powerful heads of state to a bank clerk could wear these suits. That was new, a social leveling that symbolized a political idea of equality before the law for men. If you look at this slide, think our founding fathers, sort of upper left hand, and you go across early 1800s, middle 1800s, turn of the 20th century, 30s, 40s, 1960s, 1980s. The lapels get larger or smaller, the ties get bigger or smaller. But basically, that is the style that has sustained men in their individual liberties for so long. Now, women's story is much more complicated. And I did make a slide about it, but it's very all over the place. And so we're going to be taking apart some of these components of women's clothing so that we can understand just how important it was that dress reform accompany social and political reform. So let's look first at pants. So once undergarments became popular, common, drawers came in for both men and women. They were a loose, short, kind of a pants going on underneath all those clothes, but the crotch wasn't sewn together. So when you think about it, relieving oneself at a time when plumbing or those kinds of services weren't as they are today, that was practical for both. But when the 19th century began, it's really kind of a fuzzy idea about how that undergarment got sewn up. It was maybe the theater and women who were high-stepping and kicking out their legs and stuff were flashing the people in the front row, and maybe that's a good reason to sew those up. And because actresses were not necessarily thought to be the highest of moral people to begin with, the association between sewing up those undergarments and the people in society who wore them made them unacceptable. It wasn't the fact that it might be practical. It was the fact that this woman might be toying with the fact that she was wearing pants. And a woman wearing pants, under any circumstances, was not okay. 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, the first formal meeting to discuss changes that women wanted in this country: the right to vote, access to education, increased economic opportunities. Women were calling for full legal citizenship under the law. A woman named Amelia Bloomer went to that meeting wearing a costume that would come to bear her name, the Bloomer costume. So it was a shorter skirt and a trouser underneath, completely comfortable and practical and entirely scandalous. Women now had associated dress reform with political reform from that meeting in Seneca Falls that day. Women's leg freedom became a hotly contested topic. The Chicago Tribune said that until a woman is allowed ankles, there is no hope for her brains. Not any sane person can possibly dispute the fact that women have just as much right to leg freedom as men. For some inscrutable reason, this liberty has been denied them. A New York newspaper pushed back against the idea of reform of any kind. We regret to see how obstinately American women are bent on having more than their fair share of constitutional rights. There is an obvious tendency to encroach upon male manners, which cannot be too severely criticized or too speedily repressed. Women are coming for you, and they have pants on. I don't know they thought that, but women in bloomers, obviously, they are loose, immoral, they are anti-male. Women in bloomers are obviously hysterical, deviant, and criminal. The National Dress Reform Association was founded in 1856, and it fought for dress reform, the elimination of the corset, and a total weight of undergarments under 7 pounds. But eventually the pressure was so intense on women who wore these clothes that they were absolutely ignoring the idea of reform. What did women want? They wanted the right to vote. They wanted more activities available to them in the economic world, in the educational world, and it just wasn't happening because everybody was looking at this. So women stopped wearing these clothes in public, but they kept the pressure up. From 1850 on, they started organizing state by state to see that the 19th Amendment, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, would carry. The federal government was not interested at all in looking at women's voting, but they left it to the states, and the women, it took them close to 40 years to get the first state to give them the right to vote, but they kept working on it. So we've got bloomers, sewn together or not. We've got women dressing as outliers in society, but there was another problem in the 19th century that was a very heated debate, and that is pockets. No one had pockets until the 17th century. Everyone kind of had an external satchel or bag of some kind. The late 1600s, the first pockets appear in men's clothing, in their vests and their coats and their pants. And women had pouches beneath their skirts, like a slit in the skirt, and you could reach in and there's a little pouch in there. But as clothing became more streamlined, that was kind of cumbersome, and they wanted pockets. But opposition to pockets was as strenuous as it was to bloomers. Pockets were simply for men. The sight of a woman walking along with her hands in her pockets was a shocking outrage, and none other than that New York newspaper wrote an essay ridiculing dress reformers and the political and social reform that went with it by saying no pocketless person has ever been great, and the female sex cannot rival men if it is pocketless. Pockets eventually worked their way into clothing, but the debate lasted into the 20th century. In 1954, Christian Dior said that men have pockets to put things in. Women have pockets for decoration. So let's look at some dress reformers. One of my favorite, Dr. Mary Walker. In the 1850s, she got a medical degree from Oswego Medical College, and that was in and of itself way ahead of her time. And when the Civil War broke out, she wanted to be a surgeon, a field surgeon, but she was told repeatedly, you can't be a doctor, there are no women doctors, you can volunteer as a nurse, you can drive an ambulance. Finally, in 1864, she was given a commission to be a surgeon on the field of the Civil War, but she had to have an act of Congress to allow her to wear the trousers that went with the uniform for her to serve. After the war was over, she went back to upstate New York and she had a medical practice, but she continued to wear the trousers. Well, one of the things about women in pants was that it was impersonating another person and indecent exposure. All of those things were illegal. She was arrested, and when she had her day in court, she said, I declare my right to dress as I please in a free America on whose tented fields I served in the cause of that freedom. And the judge told the police never to bother her again. So she wore her trousers until the very end of her life. Later in her life, she was a lobbyist in Washington, lobbying for the suffrage amendment. And she met Jeanette Rankin. Jeanette Rankin had just been elected to Congress, and she was there. And of course, Jeanette Rankin was an impeccable dresser in all the feminine styles. And Jeanette once asked Dr. Walker, why do you wear men's clothes? Dr. Walker says, I don't wear men's clothes, dear. I wear my own. Evelyn Cameron, our very own Evelyn Cameron. Now, in the upper left-hand corner, you see Evelyn Cameron in England before she moved to the United States. And she is on a horse, side saddle. This woman wrote that she never ever even had to brush her own hair. But when she came to Montana, she embraced a freedom that she probably couldn't have imagined when she was growing up. The far right picture is a picture of her wearing the clothes that I have on. She went to Miles City riding a horse astride. I have to get over here. I just unbuttoned this panel from here and moved it over to here because now I have leg freedom and now I can ride a horse or a bicycle or whatever else. So this outfit, this style became very popular among women. If you have to be proper most of the time, but if you want to jump on something or hike or do something, you can do so with this. It's kind of a lot of work. But indeed, finding a way to cross between the rules and not the rules was something that women were very ingenious about. All right, there we go. The back. Yeah. Yes. So she avoided being arrested. She's got her buttons here. Maybe hers was a little different style, but because she could immediately flip it over, and now I have a dress on. I have a skirt on, so don't bother me. But she was careful about that. But she also loved the freedom that she was experiencing here in Montana. And I also threw this slide in. Martha Canary, also known as Calamity Jane, she went back and forth between pants and dresses all the time. There are 26 pictures of Calamity Jane that exist. 6 of them she's in pants, which is what we usually think of her as, the buckskin-clad wild woman of the West. But often she wore dresses. Scholars think she probably wanted to go between the worlds, and wouldn't it have been nice if there hadn't been symbolic meaning assigned to clothing? We all could have worn whatever we wanted all this time. So I want to take a break from the clothing narrative to just point something out here about us as a species. So we were not born with like sharp claws and long fangs and the ability to run 40 miles an hour. In nature, we're pretty vulnerable. We have our brain and our thumbs, but we really are pretty vulnerable, and we need each other. We need each other for food procurement. We need each other for shelter. We need each other to raise our offspring. So from the very beginning of our species, we're wired to belong, to be part of a group. So when you look at these reformers who are pushing against all of the negativity coming at them about what they can't do, what they can't have, who they certainly aren't, it takes a lot of courage to stand up to that. If ostracism is the outcome of standing up for yourself, well, that's life and death to our nervous systems. Whether it's literally going to happen or whether it's just the way we feel, we all have that moment where we don't want to be left out. So when these reformers were working so hard to bring change, they were also going out on a real big limb to do it. So we celebrate not only the changes that they made, but the courage that they had to do it. So now we're going to go back here and look at the corset. I couldn't help myself. I just had to do this little demonstration. One of the reasons that it was thought inappropriate to give women political and social freedom was that a woman's physical inferiority is confirmed by the lack of a robust constitution. But how robust would anybody be if they were wrapped up in one of these? Now, to wit, if women indulge in exceptional exertion, they are prone to nervous irritability and neurasthenic disease. Delicate, high-strung, subject to fits of anxiety or even hysteria, women need to avoid anxiety-producing, enervating situations. Intense mental excitement, anger, grief, joy, pursuing an academic education. All of this brings further injury to the health. Women are too frail to be citizens, and their efforts, acted out rashly and foolishly, make them ultimately unfit for public life because of perilous injury brought on by the irritations of the outside world. The corset was the absolute symbol of Victorian dress in the 19th century and repression at the same time. The size of a woman's waist was definitely a reflection of her family's wealth and position in society. And the idea that a woman is frail, well, fragility became kind of a social acceptable way for a woman to think fainting couch. Think, oh, I just can't do that today. Well, no wonder they couldn't. And getting this corset as tightly cinched as possible was a reflection of a woman's capacity for self-sacrifice. One of the hallmarks of femininity in the 19th century. So what was she sacrificing? Well, this corset displaced internal organs. It pinched the lungs and the stomach, so you couldn't breathe or digest food very well. The atrophy of the stomach muscles was definitely part of it. The more tightly cinched the corset was. So, she's almost ready to get dressed here. So you can see why women wanted to get rid of this corset. All right, there she is. Her undergarments don't weigh 7 pounds, but after this, you put that on, then you are inching up into a lot of weight of clothing. Now, mothers on the frontier, Native women, slave women, working class women, they were all perfect examples that women are robust, they do have strength, but unfortunately, all women were not created equal. Now I'm going to go to this PowerPoint again and just show you an example of how the corset evolved. And I'm probably in the way. The 1860s, think Scarlett O'Hara. You've got an hourglass figure and a skirt with hoops underneath. The circumference of the outside of that skirt for daily wear was 91 inches. The 1870s, the hoops go away, but the fabric stays, and there's bustly looking things and drapes and such, very heavy. By the 1880s, which is what this gold one is, it's more streamlined and very severe, but that bustle in the back is definitely, and as you could see, you have to tie the cage onto your legs so that it stays in place. And by the 1890s, all of the under contraptions are gone, but the corset has changed the woman's body from an hourglass to this S shape. Hourglass figure corset, S-shaped figure. Look at the waist on her. Women often had lower ribs removed so that they could continue to cinch that corset. And I don't mean to offend anyone, But the one on the left is the normal body. And the one on the right is what women were proving with their self-sacrifice. The last gasp for the corset was the Gibson girl, 1890s to 1910. Because you know, when reform comes along and people are wanting change and they want things to be different, the people resisting them get just as loud. So here comes the Gibson girl. Again, the ultra-feminine woman, but it didn't last long because so much change had occurred and progress had been made, and an invention came along in the 1890s that women just loved: the bicycle. The bicycle. Because it had been decided that exercise is good for a woman. Exercise, to wit, gives women an energy and an endurance and a dexterity and a presence of mind that cannot be overestimated as a sedative for nervous irritability and relief from hypochondria brought on by a sedentary life. Bicycle was thought to be an instrument of the devil, because not only were women out there getting good exercise, but now they were mobile. They could move from one place to another. Didn't need to rely on someone to come along with a carriage or take them from one place to another. They could do it themselves. And this was, of course, going to be the end of American society as we know it. So, as the teens come along, in the 1890s, 4 states had given women the right to vote. In 1910, it started up again, but by the time the First World War started, women had the right to vote in a number of states. People said, we don't need a national amendment because so many of the states have given women these things they wanted, but they needed the national amendment so they could be considered citizens under the law. So in World War I, now you can see the clothing has really, and they're not worried about clothing so much, they're worried about helping out. The women in the middle were doctors, and they went to France to serve in the army there. And here on the end, this woman is pointing to a list of things that women did for the war cause. Drive ambulances, and bandages, and do telephone operating, all these things, and yet we still aren't considered citizens. By 1920, the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote was finally passed. Jeanette Rankin was in Congress, voted into Congress from Montana in 1916. 1918, Congress finally decided to debate whether or not the 19th Amendment should be added to the Constitution. It took the House 1 month after it was introduced to approve it. It took the Senate 2 years to approve it, and then another 9 months to be ratified. In August of 1920, the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution in the exact same wording that Susan B. Anthony had proposed 45 years earlier. Now, gave women the right to vote, but it didn't give, it says women, but it wasn't all women included. 1924 Native American Citizenship Act included the Native Americans. It was 1948 before Asian women were considered part of our society to be able to vote. And then black women were included in some of the amendments that included black people, but because it took women so long to be recognized. And then the discrimination against black people in general at the polls was 1965, before the Voting Rights Act really said that everyone should have the right to vote. Discrimination, prejudice still played a role in keeping that from taking place, and we're still working on it. All right, so now we're going to go quickly through the 20th century to catch up. And I see some people here who may have lived through the 1960s, which is where we're going to land here in just a bit. Clothing, all the way along the way, a definitely integral part of the story. So we got the roaring 20s. Now look at these clothes. 20 years earlier, these women were throwing that stuff out the window. And honestly, I've got clothes from 30 years ago that I still save because they're favorites. But there was no undergarments to speak of in a lot of these cases. It just was about freedom and having, in the 20s, a good time. The 1930s, we have a depression and there's not a lot of opulence and expression, but something else was on the rise, and that was Hollywood's movies, the dream factories, and women like Marlene Dietrich and Katharine Hepburn were pushing a lot of envelopes on the screen. Now in the past, actresses and women in entertainment were considered to be loose women and not very acceptable in society, but that was changing in the 30s because now everybody could go to the movies and these were becoming celebrities. People were looking up to them, and by golly, she's wearing those pants pretty regularly. It wasn't so much a function of indecent exposure anymore if a woman showed up in pants, but it certainly was frowned upon. The 1940s, World War I comes along, and then we really have women stepping into roles that had historically not been assigned to them, or historically maybe not thought that they should be even doing, out there in the world, doing the work. And I love some of these advertisements, do the job he left behind. When the war was over, though, and the men came back, women lost their jobs. They were sent home. He's back now, that we have men that need these jobs. So women had a super taste of freedom in dress and in politics and in society, but then it was taken away. And the 1950s shows us that it kind of went backwards. The clothes, the dress, now those undergarments were still, there are undergarments involved here, but they're made out of elastic at this point, so they're not quite as confining or painful as the predecessors. But yeah, we're going back here to women properly dressed. I grew up in the 1950s, and they had a sort of a thing called pedal pushers. We could wear them as kids, but I rarely saw any women wearing them. We had some mothers in our neighborhood. They were young and they were really kind of cool, and my mom was much more traditional. But these young women, mothers, they were wearing these pedal pushers, and boy, that was so neat to see. But something else was happening in the 1950s. Now go to the advertisements. This woman on the left, I think she has a new self-defrosting refrigerator. There's her mop and her bucket, but she's so happy in her heels and her dress. The middle one I find very disturbing. If you don't serve the right coffee, by golly, you might experience physical violence. And then show her it's a man's world over here. The message, what's coming at women now? The message is, I don't exactly know, I was a young girl, and I don't know what the studies would say, but the message is kind of like, let's get you back where you belong. And the role that was assigned to you, the clothing that signifies and symbolizes that you are a woman. I think it's time for another revolution. And it has to do with undergarments. In 1968, a number of women gathered in Atlantic City at the Miss America contest, and they were there to protest antiquated, demeaning display that did not celebrate substantial attributes of women. And there was a trash can there, and it had some lingerie stuff in it. And it was briefly set on fire, and it was quickly put out, but the press picked up on that, and just like they focused so much 100 years earlier on those bloomers being the problem and not the message of reform, they started to say that these radical women are burning their bras as a way to express their desire to challenge limitations on women, a symbolic act of being comfortable over meeting social expectations. The message of reform in the 1960s was equal pay, childcare, and reproductive rights. But that was all lost. There was a Illinois legislator responded to a lobbyist for equal rights amendment when he said that women were braless, brainless broads. So, what did they get out of the 1960s protest? What did these brave, persistent, braless, brainless broads get out of what they were up to? And one of the things that came out of the 1960s was a legislation that we call Title IX, 1972, prohibits sex discrimination in education programs, prohibits harassment and assault in educational settings and activities. All students, regardless of gender, have equal opportunity in education and athletics. And of course, there was backlash to this. What's going to happen to the men's sports if we let these women have their sports? And I have to think that the administrators and the superintendents and the principals, which were mostly men in those days, had to step up. The ones that didn't want it pushed, but the ones that stepped up and say, well, we'll find a way for this. And we all know just what that has done for high school athletics and college athletics and women in general, having an opportunity to be free in their quest for freedom to participate in sports. The 1960s saw another clothing reformation, another revolution, and I didn't know anything about this until I learned it for this, but I guess I wouldn't have any reason to, and that was in the civil rights movement. In the 50s and 60s, civil rights activists were protesting at lunch counters and in public marches, and there was a dress code within their ranks. People were expected to wear their Sunday best in order to demonstrate that they deserved dignity and respect. This was a direct challenge to the white power structure that endeavored to keep black people for so long at the bottom of the social hierarchy. There had been laws in the United States over the decades that required black people and slaves at that time to dress in clothing that was considered appropriate to their very low status. For black people to dress in a manner that was elegant and refined was a challenge to, again, the white power structure, and why Sunday best attire was part of the civil rights structure. Then, a new clothing revolution took place when a new generation of civil rights activists rejected the Sunday best attire as the politics of respectability. They adopted new styles that were suited to a new kind of activism. So the Black Panthers, for example, wore black leather jackets, turtlenecks, berets, and sunglasses, and that was a new visual statement designed to express a different kind of resistance to the status quo and a different type of racial pride that didn't borrow from all that symbolic white structure and constructed instead a brand new aesthetic. And then from the 60s onward, we all know that clothing has always been evolving and changing. I'm going to stop right there for a break and see if anybody has any questions about the story, the clothing, anything that they might want to ask about or talk about. Yes?
So you talked a lot about the styles of the upper class because that's the aspiration to get to, right? So it's a style that is not conducive to work, but obviously there was a lot of working women who had, and ranch women who had to work. So how did their style vary?
Every bit of this, every era that we've gone through could have its own program. I was focused on what was considered the normal, acceptable style for dress in public, for propriety. Now in the West, it was different. Women were working on ranches and they were wearing clothes like this and pushing a lot of those things aside. But if they got dressed up to go to town, they wanted, the assumption was, they wanted to look like what was completely acceptable at the time. So they would have wanted to wear these clothes. Again, that's a broad statement. I'm sure there were plenty who didn't or couldn't. I mean, this is definitely an economic structure too, to be able to afford all of the clothes that were seen as acceptable. But yes, I even started looking at the working class clothing, and it's you know, it's again a program unto itself. I didn't want to get too outside of the ideas of why clothing reform was associated with political and social reform. But for example now, that three-piece suit, vest, was a necessary component because men held their pants up with suspenders. Suspenders are considered undergarments. So you see a man out, in fact, you see that sometimes in movies they'll do it right. They'll have a guy working outside in the field and somebody comes along in a carriage and he'll go over to the fence and get his jacket on because it's improper to just be out there with suspenders showing. That changed in the 1920s when belts came around. Men could hold their pants up with belts, and now suspenders found their way out of favor for clothing.
As a part of your presentation, I was seeing that, like in the 1800s, the gentleman would have a stovetop hat, a coat, vest, and pants, which they probably purchased. I imagine they had one set of clothing, and I imagine the ladies would need to have several or a number of different types of clothing, that you wouldn't wear the same dresses every day. But I also think that back then, didn't the women, wasn't there an expectation that they made their own clothes, whereas the men would purchase their clothes?
That is a great question with a lot of a very spread out answer. Women who were in modest circumstances, absolutely. They made their own clothes largely. They knew how to sew from the beginning. When you look at old patterns, they don't even have instructions. They just say this and this and this, and you just knew because all your life you'd been sewing. The upper classes had seamstresses, had more choices in the clothing that they had, and there again the Sunday best idea. You know, you have your working clothes. I remember Sunday best when I was growing up. You know, we had the clothes we wore to church. And so yes, there was definitely a set of clothes that you kept separate, but depending on your economic station, maybe you only had one set for work and one set for good, and then when this wore out, you demoted these and got a new good set if you could. When you look at the Gilded Age, which was sort of, again, the last gasp of some of this clothing, symbolic clothing that was just so restrictive. The upper classes the clothing of the times was just elaborate and excessive, and those women had lots of choices, 2 or 3 outfits a day perhaps. But they also had people to dress them, so they didn't have to worry about struggling into all this stuff. They could be dressed by someone. And yes, men, again, economics makes a big difference, but to have a Sunday best, to have an outfit that you wore out that was as acceptable as you could make it to what was expected. And then, of course, your work clothes. Yeah. Listen.
Two things, pedal pushers and saddle pants. In the 50s, I had saddle pants, but I wasn't allowed to wear them to downtown. And you would never wear jeans downtown. You had to have a dress or skirt. My mother started wearing pedal pushers that had matching blouses. But she only wore them when we were going to Seeley Lake to our cabin. You didn't wear them in town. And she was one who always wore high heels and had her nails done, and her hair just right. But it was always a family joke, because my father, when she'd see her, he would see her in her pedal pushers. He called it her pig suit.
Her what?
Her pig suit. And that was, that sounds horrible, doesn't it? But it
a
was,
lot of this.
I suppose it was a joke between the two of them. And he was not a demonstrative person. So that's about as demonstrative as he got.
Okay. I think we all have stories. Jeans, I remember when jeans, my father was appalled when I was in high school and I wanted to wear, he said, he called them dungarees. And those are for the farm, and how, for heaven's sakes, you know. But in the 60s, when you're growing up and people are wearing jeans, my mother had a pair of dungarees. She wore them one day a year when she cleaned the back porch, the winter dirt off of the back porch, and got all the summer furniture out. And she had a t-shirt and a pair of these dungarees. And the one day of a year that she wore those, if I came home for lunch from school, I got to see her in pants. But it wasn't until way into the 70s that she ever wore pants. It just, we're raised the way we're raised, and it sticks. What's proper?
I graduated in 1971, and we had to wear dresses or skirts, and we had to wear nylons. And when they called, we had to go to the gym, kneel down, and they'd measure that they weren't too short. Cold, freezing, we still had to wear dresses.
Yeah. Yes. I wonder, there's a good question. We grew up, those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, watching all this happening out in the world, did we realize what was happening? Did we associate it with the truly revolutionary things that were happening? Yeah. It's interesting how living through something and then coming out the other side of it and looking back.
I don't even know if you know the answer to this. Were those hoop skirts, were those bone? What did they make those?
So the hoop skirts, Anthony. So if I go all the way back, I can just do this. Okay, so these are, and this was, talk about environmental upset, that early boning, they called it, was the baleen of whales. So whales were being slaughtered for two things: their oil for fuel, and then the baleen of whales, because it was real flexible. And the warmer it got on your body, the more flexible it became. And early on, these were made out of wood. They were made out of reeds tied together, you know, rushes and what have you, grasses and things. Whatever could stand up under the weight of fabric. It wasn't until the late 1880s into the early 1890s that steel started to be used for stays. And then during World War I, another reason the corset went out was because the Minister of War said to women, please don't wear corsets anymore, we need the steel for the war effort. So you got a pass getting rid of that corset. But yes, early on this was baleen, this was, could be rope, and this was all cotton. Well, you know, like the ribbon stuff, the canvas pieces of cotton, yeah.
So can they sit down in those?
With difficulty, yeah, you can sit. So I wore hoops at one time when I was in Colorado, and the place where I was interpreting was 1860s. So I had the hoops, which are just the big round hoops all around, and you can bunch it up into the back, keep the front covered, and then sit down and then you have a great big thing going on in the back. But these weren't easy to sit in. You had to figure it out. A lot of times, and women got ridiculed for this, is they'd be getting on or off a horse-drawn carriage of some kind, and one of those would catch on something, and then you'd go flying, and your hoops go up, and your crinolines are all over, and a good reason to sew up those drawers, I think. Yeah.
I don't know if it's really a question or not, but I think of how fire, when how did they protect from their clothes catching on fire when they're 91 inches wide, and how did they clean them?
That's a great question. I was doing a program called Well-Behaved Women Rarely Make History, and a woman came up to me. I had dressed my mannequin with the same litany of things that were said about women, and it's just, she came up afterwards. She was shaking her finger at this mannequin. She said, my grandmother was standing near a fire, and her clothes caught, and in the dry fabric of the time just went up in flames. She died right then and there. And she said the clothing reform, of course, that was one of the big questions. Women are in kitchens with wood stoves. They're out and about. It was definitely, I mean, there were so many layers to why this clothing was not good. But absolutely, fire was a big thing. Of course, with all that restriction to the body, then also this was not a healthy way to dress. People were sick. Someone once commented that corsets cause everything but old age and war. They just are bad, and they should be gone. Doctors said right from the beginning of the reform era, yes, get rid of corsets, they're bad. That was Mary Walker's father, was one of the big proponents, but of course we all want to belong, and if the group is all doing something, then we need to do it so that we feel like we're part. We don't want to be left out.
In that respect, you can look at the Barbie dolls that are still that way. They have that restriction on the waist, the hourglass, and that's what we're supposed to look like, you know. They're finally changing. Some of them, you know, they maybe now have a wheelchair or whatever, but they're still building those Barbie dolls to look like that.
And think about Barbie doll, it was 1959, so she's coming out in the time when that was the idealized woman's body, women's clothing, and into the early 1960s. Yeah, she's gone through some transformations, thankfully, over the years, so that girls don't.
Do you think it has anything political to do with how we see the reoccurrence? When I was going to high school, oh, it's the 50s. We're going back to the 50s clothing, and then the 70s, and you know, the bell bottoms were in, and then they were out, and now they're back again. It's funny to see how now they recycle all of these newer ones.
Correct, and that's interesting. There's trends today that go in and out, and certainly social media and all the young people so influenced by the social media, and the trend can come in. They call it fast fashion today. Some designer might come up with something, and within 6 months it's being mass produced somewhere and sold at Target and Costco, and then 6 months later it's out, and you have a new fast fashion. And this is environmentally bad because it takes a lot of water and a lot of energy to create all those clothes, and then where do they go? Who wants them if they're out? But we now don't have the same restrictions politically and socially, you can pretty much wear what we want. But the corset, for example, if you look it up online, and this is again a whole nother program, could just be about corsets. So before corsets in the 19th century, there was a thing called stays, and it was just it didn't try to shape you. It was just almost two pieces of heavy cardboard with fabric over it, and it tied together under your arms, and it just held the top of you together. It had a little tiny, almost little peplum skirt around it. And when that went away, then the corset came in. But that stays is definitely a very big trend today. Women aren't tying them real tight, but they are wearing them in all sorts of situations for social, dress up. If you look again online, you'll see I was amazed at how that is coming back. And then you have the steampunk groups with kind of a quasi-historic look to it, but also very modern. So that's a look. Yeah, very much. Yes?
Two quick things. I was born in 72. I know a woman's not supposed to tell her age, but I didn't realize how much things had changed by the time I became aware. I never felt pressure to wear anything particular, although my dad did make me wear nylons when I wore a dress to church, which I can't even imagine putting those on my daughter. Horrible. But also, I teach a class on building corsets for beginners over at Carroll College every couple of years. Kim, by the way. We talked on the phone, but I just haven't met you in person yet. But what I find interesting is my students are fascinated with corsets. They make them and they wear them. They do not reduce their size by 7, 8, 9 inches like the women did historically, but they love to wander around in public with their waist cinchers on because they like that support. But they're maybe only pulling themselves in 1.5 inches. And I'm not sure what that's about, but that class fills every time I offer it. They want to make corsets.
Corsets aren't that difficult to make. I've made a few. I've made this one and a couple of others. And all it really is a whole bunch of pieces of fabric. I'm not, taking away from the fact that you make. I teach absolute beginners who've never used a sewing machine. So I would always lay them out in a row and sew them together in order. Then I'd go back in and make the little channel for the stays. Now the stays in this are plastic tubing. I mean, they're not. I have made some with the metal. Spiral steel. But plastic warms up if you wear it. And so then you go back and then you just keep going down the row over and over until you've got all the pieces together and all the ways that you want it to look together. It's interesting that it's circling back around. What is that? Are women thinking that they want to be restricted?
It's a big feminine out there. I mean, the dresses have lots of material. I mean, I think there's a big, lots of cloth, feminine.
Lots of cloth, feminine, okay. Well, and guess what? Nowadays, we can pretty much wear what we want. I wanted to just, and we can keep talking, this is great, but I wanted to just end with this slide. And it fits in with all that we're saying. What does clothing symbolize today? And what roles are people required to fill if they're wearing this or that, or who wears what? Are we done with all that? I think the lines between one or the other, this or that, who wears what, it's definitely becoming much more fluid. I wanted to leave you with this idea, though. Clothing reform and these coming backs and these going aways will probably always go hand in hand with social reform, because we all want to belong, but not at the expense of our freedom. So I will take more questions if we have them. I love this little free person who doesn't know the difference between men's and women's clothing. And if we just were that way, we wouldn't have to worry about it. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I know we had 2 more people with hands raised for questions, so I'll let you guys ask your questions, but also we are at time, so after that you'll just have to come up and talk to Mary Jane if you have more.
Yes, please.
A very nice presentation, thank you. There's been a convergence of women's dresses towards appearance similar to men, pants and that sort of thing. Yet there's always a persistent, it appears to me, need to discriminate or distinguish female dress from male dress. There's always a dimorphism. Like, now, is that a human need, do you think, that we will always have the sense that women need to be dressed distinctly different than men?
Wow. Well, is there a human need for the sexes, the genders, to be different? Anybody have a comment about that? Pardon?
Only when you want to have babies. One of the places where I've recently seen similarities is like with nuns and priests wearing the robes. And I don't know if that's intentional I mean, obviously not the Catholic Church to equalize them, but to desex them, maybe, yeah.
It's a very interesting question. I don't have an answer. Is there a need? When I started doing historical programs, and I ended up wearing clothes like that, which I have, and I honestly don't think I'd fit in that gold dress anymore because I'm not about to close up that corset as tight as I'd have to get back into that. But I felt the rebellion. I felt that, get me out of this thing. And I thought, is that because I live in the 2000s, or is it because I'm a human being that says that doesn't feel good? So that's a very good question. How much does our society think's coming at us, telling us who we are and what we have to do and why, and then the clothing, giving us that symbolic identity so that we can fill our role in society, and then that internal voice that says, hey, you need to belong. You don't ever want to be outside of the group. We'll do whatever it takes, because if we don't, we might not survive. Not literally, but that's, our species has that going on. So that's a great question. And I think because there's so much more freedom today, I think every person can decide. We have a lot of opportunities to wear what we want. You could have worn anything you want. I see women in pants. I see women with pockets.
So 2 things. One's a comment, one's a question. One, I remember I was in middle school in 2005 when Regency drama was totally in. Pride and Prejudice 2005, and I still, looking back, Empire waists were on all of my clothes. That's just how it was. My question is, for a lot of what prompted reform and then stuff that's kind of gone back and forth over time, women's dress, how much of that would you say is women choosing what they want, and how much of that is, as much as men often left going, oh, women have to have this and that, how much of that was men saying, this is what you need to look like for us?
If this is the group that's making the rules, now remember, men have had pants for a long time. Practical, utilitarian, they can move around, they're not restricted in any way. And then women's shapes have always evolved to satisfy the current ideal of beauty, the current ideal of what we think is, you know, nice. So again, flatness, voluptuousness, wide hips, front and back, all that was going on. Did the men come up with that, or did the women slowly evolve into those things? It's a great question. But however it came to pass, women were always wanting to be proper so that they could be filling the expected roles in society. It's the people who said, I don't want to wear this anymore because it's making me ill, that burst out of it. Was she, did she have a good father who said, okay, you can wear what you want? Or did she have a husband that said, I'll support you, wear what you want? That's really very interesting questions to all of this. But we land in today, luckily, and we have our choices.
So, well, thank you so much, Mary Jane. That was wonderful.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming.